The night I realized my family had already replaced me was the night before Christmas, when my own mother told me to be reasonable, while standing between me and the documents that proved I no longer existed in my grandmother's will. My name is Lauren Whitmore. I was 32 years old then, old enough to know the difference between love and leverage, but still naive enough to believe blood would protect me from being erased. I was wrong. I had driven back to my parents' house in Maplewood, New Jersey, after a 12-hour shift at the hospital. I worked as a clinical operations manager, the kind of job that kept my phone buzzing at all hours, and taught me how to stay calm while everything fell apart. Christmas was supposed to be the one night I did not have to manage anything. I brought store-bought pie, cheap wrapping paper, and a quiet hope that for once I would just be a daughter, not a problem to be solved. The house looked the same as it always had. White lights trimmed along the roofline, a wreath on the door, the faint smell of pine and lemon cleaner. Inside, my mother Carol was setting the table, her movements sharp and efficient. My father, Stephen, sat in his usual chair, scrolling through his phone. My younger brother, Jason, leaned against the counter, laughing at something on his screen. No one hugged me. I noticed that before anything else. Dinner passed in fragments. My mother talked about church schedules. My father mentioned a neighbor's new car. Jason complained about traffic and his startup being underappreciated. No one asked about my job. No one asked why I looked tired. I told myself it was fine. I had learned long ago not to expect space at that table. It was after dinner, when the plates were cleared and the television murmured softly in the background, that my grandmother's name came up. "Did you hear back from the attorney?" Jason asked casually, not looking at me. My mother froze for half a second. My father cleared his throat. "Yes," Carol said. "Everything is finalized." The word finalized landed hard. I felt it before I understood it. "Finalized what?" I asked. My mother turned to me with a practiced smile, the kind she used when she wanted to sound kind while delivering bad news. "Your grandmother's estate, Lauren. It's been settled." I blinked. Settled how? Jason finally looked up. He gave me a quick glance, then looked away. "It's not a big deal." That was when I knew it was. My grandmother Ruth had raised me as much as my parents had. When I was 14 and my parents sent me to stay with her because I was too difficult, she was the one who listened to me cry in the guest room. When I put myself through college, she slipped envelopes of cash into my bag and told me not to tell anyone. When she got sick, I was the one who drove her to appointments and organized her medications. Jason visited on holidays. She had told me, more than once, that she wanted to make things fair. Fair was a word my family hated. "What does settled mean?" I asked again, more slowly. My father stood up. "Lauren, let's not do this tonight." "Do what?" "Create drama," my mother said. "It's Christmas." I felt something tighten in my chest. Am I in the will? The silence answered before they did. Jason shifted his weight. "It's complicated." "It's not," I said. "Either I am or I'm not." My mother sighed, as if I were exhausting her. "Your grandmother made changes before she passed. She felt Jason needed more support." More support. Jason, who had moved back home rent-free. Jason, whose business my parents quietly funded. Jason, who had never been asked to explain himself. "And me?" I asked. My voice sounded calm. That surprised me. "You're independent," Carol said. "You always have been. You don't need help." There it was. The compliment that functioned like a door slammed shut. I looked at my father. "You knew?" He nodded once. We all agreed it was for the best. Agreed. Without me. "Can I see the will?" I asked. My mother's expression changed. Just slightly. "That's not necessary." "I'd like to see it." "It's handled," she said. "The attorney advised us not to stir things up." I smiled then, thin and automatic. "Whose attorney?" Jason answered before my parents could. "Mine." Of course it was. I stood up slowly. I felt very clear, very awake. "So you had your lawyer handle Grandma's estate." "She wanted it that way," Jason said quickly. "She trusted me." I thought of my grandmother's handwriting, shaky but determined. The way she used to say, "Don't let anyone tell you what's practical when it's really just convenient for them." "I want a copy," I said. My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice. Lauren, don't embarrass us. I'm not embarrassed, I said. I'm curious. She put a hand on my arm, a gesture meant to calm but used to control. You don't need to dig into this. You're doing fine. You have your career. Your brother is still building his future. I gently removed her hand. That future, I said, is built on something that belonged to both of us. My father shook his head. You're being unfair. The word landed differently now. Unfair. From people who had decided my worth based on how little I asked for. I'm going to ask one more time, I said. May I see the will? Jason laughed, short and sharp. You always do this. You make everything legal. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger, not sadness. Recognition. They were not afraid of my feelings. They were afraid of my questions. I'll get it myself, I said. I grabbed my coat and walked toward the door. My mother followed me, her voice tight. If you do this, you'll regret it. I paused with my hand on the knob. Regret what? I asked. Knowing the truth? No one answered. Outside, the air was cold and clean. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands on the wheel, watching the lights glow in the windows of the house I no longer felt welcome in. I did not cry. Instead, I pulled out my phone and searched for estate attorneys. I didn't know yet how deep this went. I didn't know what else had been signed, transferred, or hidden. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had made a decision without me, and I was done letting that stand. I met the lawyer 3 days after Christmas, in an office that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. His name was Daniel Hargrove. Mid-50s, calm eyes, no unnecessary warmth. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. That mattered to me. I told him everything, without drama. I stuck to dates, names, facts. Years at my grandmother's house, medical appointments, financial help she gave me quietly. The night my family admitted the will had been finalized without me, Daniel didn't interrupt. He took notes in neat, compact handwriting. When I finished, he leaned back slightly. Do you have any written communication from your grandmother about her intentions? Yes, I said. Text messages, birthday cards, emails. She wasn't subtle. That's good, he replied. And when was the will changed? That's what I don't know. They wouldn't show it to me. He nodded once. We'll request it formally. As a potential heir, you're entitled to see it. Potential heir. The phrase landed with a weight I hadn't realized I needed. Here's what concerns me, he continued. When a will is changed close to the end of someone's life, especially when one beneficiary is heavily involved and another is excluded, it raises questions. About manipulation, I said. Yes, he said. About undue influence. The words settled in my chest, not as comfort, but as clarity. On the drive home, my phone rang. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. Lauren, please don't do this. You're tearing the family apart. I deleted it, without replaying it. The next message was from my father. We're worried about you. This isn't healthy. Then Jason. A text. You're overreacting. Grandma knew what she was doing. I didn't reply. Silence was the first boundary I had set in years, and it felt unfamiliar, but steady. 2 days later, Daniel forwarded me the will. I read it in my apartment, sitting at the small kitchen table where I usually sorted bills and schedules. The language was clean, professional. My grandmother's signature was there, dated just 6 weeks before she died. Everything went to Jason. The house, the investment account, the small trust she'd set up years earlier. My name appeared once, in a clause that stated I had already been adequately provided for during life. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Adequately provided for. I thought of the envelopes of cash she'd slipped me, the grocery bag she insisted on paying for, the way she used to say, "This is just between us." She had never used words like adequate. Daniel called me that evening. There's something else, he said. The attorney who drafted this will? He's Jason's longtime counsel, not your grandmother's previous lawyer. Is that unusual? I asked. It's not ideal, he said carefully, especially given the circumstances. I closed my eyes. So what happens now? I asked. We investigate, he said. We gather evidence, and we prepare for resistance. Resistance came faster than I expected. The next morning, my parents showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door and saw my mother's tight smile, my father's rigid posture. They stepped inside without asking, as if my space still belonged to them. "We need to talk," Carol said. "I know," I replied. "You should have talked to me before you changed the will." My father frowned. "That's not fair." "There it is again," I said quietly. That word. Jason hadn't come. That told me everything. "You're hurting your brother," my mother said. "He's under a lot of pressure." "And I'm not?" I asked. She waved a hand dismissively. "You're strong. You always bounce back." "I'm tired of bouncing," I said. My father sat down heavily. "What do you want, Lauren?" The question wasn't curious. It was transactional. "I want transparency," I said. "I want accountability. And I want you to stop pretending this was done out of love." My mother's eyes flashed. "How dare you?" "I dare. Because I was there," I said. "I was there when Grandma cried about feeling managed. I was there when she asked me to keep things quiet because Jason got angry when she talked about fairness." My father's face drained of color. Carol looked at him sharply. "That's not true." He didn't answer. Silence filled the room, thick and telling. "This is what's going to happen," I said. "My lawyer will be in touch. I won't discuss this informally anymore." My mother stood abruptly. "If you take this to court, don't expect us to support you." I met her gaze. "You already chose not to." They left without saying goodbye. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not because I felt safe, but because I had stopped pretending. Over the next days, details surfaced like splinters. Bank transfers Jason had helped my grandmother manage. Emails sent from her account that didn't sound like her. Witnesses to the will who had never met her before. Daniel laid it all out methodically. "This isn't about revenge," he said during one meeting. "It's about restoring intent." I nodded. "I know." But privately, I felt something else growing. Not rage. Resolve. I wasn't trying to punish my family. I was trying to reclaim my place in my own story. The first formal letter went out the following week, a notice of intent to contest the will. Jason responded within hours. Not to me, to Daniel. Aggressive, defensive, confident. He thought I would fold. He thought I would get tired. He had always mistaken my patience for weakness. That night, as I sat alone with the city humming outside my window, I understood something with startling clarity. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about how easily they had erased me when I stopped being useful. And I wasn't done uncovering what else they had taken while I was busy being independent. Jason hired his own attorney within 48 hours of receiving the notice. That alone told me he was nervous. People who feel untouchable don't scramble that fast. Daniel called me the morning after. "They're pushing back hard," he said, "claiming the will reflects your grandmother's clear intent and that you're acting out of resentment." "Of course they are," I replied. "What matters," he continued, "is that we stay factual. Emotional narratives help them. Documentation helps us." I had spent years learning how to separate emotion from action. Hospital crisis management had taught me that panic wastes time. I applied the same discipline now. Over the next week, I went through every message my grandmother had ever sent me. Text, emails, voicemails I had saved because I liked the sound of her voice. I printed them, labeled them, organized them by date. Patterns emerged. Mentions of fairness, of wanting to set things straight, of Jason being too involved with her finances. One message stopped me cold. "If anything changes suddenly, promise me you'll ask questions." I stared at that line for a long time. At the same time, Daniel subpoenaed records related to my grandmother's accounts. The first batch came back incomplete. Missing months. Transactions that had been consolidated. Jason's fingerprints were everywhere. Not directly, not in a way that screamed guilt, but in the quiet, administrative ways power is exercised. He had positioned himself as the gatekeeper, the helper, the son who handled things so no one else had to, including me. My parents stayed silent. No calls, no messages. Their silence was not neutrality. It was alignment. One evening, my Aunt Margaret called. She had always been the observant one in the family, the person who noticed tension and pretended not to. "I heard what's going on," she said cautiously. "Yes," I replied. A pause. Then, "Your grandmother asked me once if I thought Jason was pressuring her." My grip tightened on the phone. "What did you say?" "I told her I didn't know," Margaret admitted. But I told her she didn't owe anyone anything. Did she say why she asked? She said she felt rushed, Margaret said, like decisions were being made for her. I closed my eyes. Would you be willing to say that under oath? I asked. Margaret exhaled slowly. Yes. The first hearing was scheduled for late January. Jason arrived, confident, tailored suit, easy smile. The same expression he used at family gatherings when he wanted to look like the reasonable one. I didn't look at him. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, listened without interruption as Daniel outlined our position. Sudden changes, questionable counsel, disproportionate benefit. Jason's attorney countered with language about independence and ingratitude, about how I had built my own life and no longer needed family resources. I noticed how often they said needed, as if worth was measured by dependency. During a break, Jason approached me. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. We can work something out. I looked at him then. Really looked. You had every chance to work something out, I said. You chose secrecy instead. He smiled tightly. You always want control. I shook my head. No, I want consent. The judge ordered further discovery. Not a victory, but not a dismissal either. After the hearing, my mother finally called. Her voice was brittle. You embarrassed us. I told the truth, I replied. You're painting Jason like a villain. I'm not painting anything, I said. I'm presenting facts. She lowered her voice. If you keep this up, you're going to lose your family. I let the words sit between us. I think I already did, I said. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, paperwork spread across the table. I felt the weight of it all, but not regret. For the first time, I understood that loyalty in my family had always flowed one way, upward, toward the person they had chosen. And when I stopped playing my role, they closed ranks without hesitation. The case moved slowly, methodically, as these things do. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Jason's business began to wobble. Investors grew cautious. Rumors traveled faster than facts. And I knew, deep down, that the story they had told themselves was starting to crack. They thought I was fighting for money. They didn't yet understand what I was really reclaiming. By February, the air around my family had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way rooms feel different after a door has been closed for good. People spoke more carefully. Smiles lasted a second too long. Everyone was waiting to see who would fall first. Jason's confidence began to thin. It started with small things: a postponed deposition, a request for more time to produce financial records, delays that were framed as administrative but felt like stalling. Daniel noticed it immediately. They're scrambling, he told me during one of our weekly calls. When people have nothing to hide, they don't ask for extensions like this. I was at work when the first real fracture appeared. I was reviewing staffing reports when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I usually let those go, but something told me not to. This is Monica Reyes, the woman said. I used to work for your brother. I stepped into an empty conference room and closed the door. She said you might call, I replied carefully. She told me not to, Monica said. But I can't stop thinking about it. She explained that she had been Jason's office manager for 3 years, that she had handled scheduling, invoices, and correspondence, that she had left suddenly last fall. Because of your grandmother? I asked. Yes, she said. He asked me to draft emails in her voice. Nothing illegal, he said, just to help her communicate. But they didn't sound like her. My pulse stayed steady. My hands did not. Did you keep copies? I asked. There was a pause. Then, yes. That night, I forwarded everything to Daniel. He didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "This changes the tone of the case." A week later, Jason's attorney requested a closed-door settlement meeting. My parents called the same day. My father's voice was tired. Your brother is under a lot of stress. I'm aware, I said. Do you really want to drag this out? He asked. People are starting to talk. That's not my concern, I replied. What do you want, Lauren? My mother asked again. The same question, the same transactional tone. I want the truth acknowledged, I said. In writing. They went quiet. The settlement meeting took place in a neutral office downtown. No windows, neutral walls. Everything designed to keep emotion out. Jason sat across from me, his jaw tight. He didn't look at me until the end. Daniel laid out the evidence calmly. Emails, financial inconsistencies, witness statements. Jason's attorney listened, nodded, adjusted his glasses. When Daniel finished, the attorney cleared his throat. Given the circumstances, my client is prepared to revise the distribution. Not enough, Daniel said. Jason leaned forward then. What do you want? I met his eyes. I want my grandmother's original intent restored, I said. And I want an acknowledgement that you interfered. His face flushed. You're asking me to admit wrongdoing. Yes, I said, because you did. He laughed, sharp and humorless. You've always needed to win. I shook my head. No, I needed you to stop deciding for me. The meeting ended without agreement. 2 days later, Monica submitted an affidavit. 3 days after that, Jason's lead investor pulled out. The timeline was not a coincidence. My parents stopped calling. In the silence that followed, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Because for the first time, I wasn't being asked to manage their discomfort. I was managing my own future. The next hearing was scheduled for March. And this time, I wasn't walking in as the overlooked daughter. I was walking in with proof. The second hearing felt different before it even began. Not because the room had changed, but because the balance inside it had. Jason arrived late. That alone would have meant nothing to anyone else. But I knew him well enough to recognize the shift. He was never late when he believed he was in control. His suit was still expensive, still tailored, but it hung a little looser on his shoulders, like armor worn too long. My parents sat behind him this time, not beside him, behind. A small distance, but deliberate. My mother's hands were folded tightly in her lap. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw set. Neither looked at me. Daniel leaned toward me and spoke quietly. Let them show the strain. You don't need to. I nodded. The judge reviewed the new filings without expression. Monica's affidavit, the email drafts, the financial records that showed Jason had consolidated accounts without written authorization during the final months of my grandmother's life. Nothing dramatic, just a slow accumulation of facts that refused to be ignored. Jason's attorney spoke first. His tone was careful now, no longer dismissive. He framed the situation as a misunderstanding, a well-meaning son who overstepped while trying to help an aging parent, a sister who felt hurt and excluded and was now seeking validation through litigation. I watched Jason as he listened. He kept his eyes on the table, his fingers tapping once, then stopping. He knew this version was thin. When it was Daniel's turn, he stood without rushing. This case is not about feelings, he said. It is about process, about consent, about whether a vulnerable individual was allowed to make independent decisions, or whether those decisions were guided, shaped, and ultimately replaced by someone who stood to benefit. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse, he simply laid out a timeline. When my grandmother's health declined, when Jason began managing her accounts, when the will was changed, when her longtime attorney was replaced, when communications in her name no longer matched her voice. Then he said something that made the room go still. My client is not asking for punishment. She is asking for restoration. The judge looked at me for the first time. Ms. Whitmore, she said, why did you wait until now to act? It was a fair question. One my family had asked in their own way for years. I stood. I trusted them, I said. I trusted that my brother would act in good faith. I trusted my parents when they told me everything was handled. And I trusted that if something was wrong, someone would say so. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. When I realized that trust had been used to keep me quiet, I stopped waiting. The judge nodded once. Jason's attorney asked for a recess. In the hallway, Jason finally turned to me. This is ruining everything, he said under his breath. I studied his face. The tension, the resentment, the disbelief that things had not bent his way. You ruined it, I replied. I'm just refusing to carry it for you. My mother stepped closer, her voice urgent. Lauren, please, think about the family. I looked at her then. Really looked. For years, I said quietly, you told me to be understanding, to be flexible, to not take things personally. This is what happens when I stop. Her eyes filled, but she said nothing. When the hearing resumed, the judge issued a preliminary ruling. The will would be temporarily set aside. The estate placed under independent administration until a full determination could be made. Jason's breath left him in a sharp exhale. It wasn't the end, but it was no longer his. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered. Not many, just enough. Jason's name was known in certain circles. A local business owner, a family man. He walked past them without comment. I didn't stop either. That night, I went home and cooked a simple meal. Pasta, olive oil, garlic. The kind of dinner my grandmother used to make when she wanted to feel normal. I ate at the table, not standing at the counter the way I used to when I was always rushing. For the first time since this began, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not victory, space. The next day, Daniel called. "There's something else," he said. During discovery, we found references to a trust amendment that was never filed. My hand stilled around my coffee mug. What kind of amendment? One that would have split the estate, he said. Evenly. I closed my eyes. "And where is it?" I asked. "That," he said, "is the question." The case was no longer just about undue influence. It was about concealment. And someone had gone out of their way to make sure a document disappeared. I thought of the night before Christmas. My mother's hand on my arm, her voice, telling me not to dig. I understood now what they had been protecting. And I understood something else just as clearly. This wasn't over. Not even close. The missing trust amendment became the quiet center of everything. It wasn't dramatic on the surface. No secret vault, no handwritten confession. Just a reference in an email chain between my grandmother's former attorney and a paralegal, dated 8 months before her death. Draft reflects equal distribution. Client requested revision. Awaiting execution. Execution. The words sat there like a door that had never been opened. Daniel called me into his office the next morning. "If this amendment was signed and then withheld," he said, "we're no longer talking about interpretation. We're talking about concealment of estate documents." "Which is illegal," I said. "Yes," he replied, "and serious." I didn't feel triumph. I felt cold. Because concealment required intent. Someone had made a decision, not just to benefit themselves, but to erase evidence of my grandmother's choice. We subpoenaed the former attorney. His name was Paul Keegan. Late 60s, semi-retired. He came in, defensive, but careful, the way men do when they know they are standing close to a line. "I prepared the amendment," he confirmed, under oath, "at your grandmother's request." "Was it signed?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Paul said, "in my presence." I felt my spine straighten. "Then where is it?" Daniel asked. Paul hesitated, just long enough. "It was collected," he said finally, "along with other documents, by your brother, Jason." "When?" Daniel asked. 2 weeks after the signing, Paul replied. He said he was consolidating paperwork before moving his mother into assisted care. "And you gave him the original?" Daniel asked. Paul swallowed. Yes. The room went very quiet. Outside the deposition room, Daniel turned to me. "That was a mistake on his part," he said. "But it doesn't absolve your brother." "No," I said. "It exposes him." Jason's attorney requested another settlement meeting that same afternoon. This time, my parents attended too. The tone was different from the moment we sat down. No confidence, no moral lectures, just tension. Jason spoke first. "Let's end this." "You had multiple chances to end this," I replied. "You chose to hide things instead." My father rubbed his temples. "Lauren, this is going too far." "Farther than rewriting Grandma's wishes?" I asked. My mother's voice cracked. "We were trying to protect the family." I looked at her steadily. "You were protecting Jason." No one contradicted me. Daniel laid out our position. If the amendment was not produced, we would petition the court to presume spoliation. Intentional destruction or concealment of evidence. The consequences would be severe. Jason's attorney leaned back, silent. Jason stared at the table. "You know what's worse than losing money?" I said quietly. "Being exposed as someone who needed to control everything." He looked up then, his eyes sharp. "You think you're better than me?" "No," I said. "I think I'm done letting you decide who matters." The meeting ended without agreement again. That night, my mother came to my apartment alone. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. "I didn't know he took the amendment," she said softly. I believed she hadn't known that part. "It didn't change anything." "But you knew I was being cut out," I replied. She nodded. "We thought you'd be okay." That sentence had shaped my entire life. "I'm not okay," I said. "I'm capable." She cried then, quietly. No theatrics. "I don't know how to fix this," she said. "You don't," I replied. "I do." After she left, I sat alone and thought about my grandmother, about how often she warned me that silence was a form of permission. The next week, Jason's attorney contacted Daniel. They had located the amendment. It was unsigned. A copy. Useless. Daniel smiled when he told me. "That confirms intent," he said. "They're panicking." The court scheduled the next hearing for early April. This one would determine whether sanctions would be imposed. Jason stopped showing up at work regularly. His business partners distanced themselves. My parents stopped attending church. The family narrative was unraveling. One evening, as I reviewed documents at my table, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about closure, about the moment I would no longer have to prove that I deserved to be included. The law would do that for me. And for the first time, I understood the difference between revenge and reclamation. Revenge looks outward. Reclamation comes home. The sanctions hearing was scheduled for April 4th. I remember the date because it was my grandmother's birthday. That felt intentional, even if it wasn't. By then, the case had grown quieter in public and sharper in private. No reporters, no gossip, just filings, motions, and sealed envelopes moving between offices. The kind of work that doesn't look dramatic, but changes outcomes permanently. Jason did not come to the hearing. That was the first thing the judge noted. "Is the respondent present?" she asked, scanning the room. Jason's attorney stood. "My client is unable to attend due to personal circumstances." The judge's expression didn't change. Noted. Daniel stood next. "Your Honor," he said, "we are requesting sanctions for spoliation of evidence, specifically the intentional concealment and subsequent destruction or withholding of a signed trust amendment." He spoke slowly, carefully. He didn't accuse Jason of malice. He didn't need to. The timeline spoke for itself. Signed document, collected by Jason, never filed, never produced, suddenly reappearing as an unsigned copy once litigation began. The judge asked a single question. "Is there any explanation from the respondent as to why the signed original was not preserved?" Jason's attorney hesitated. "No satisfactory explanation, Your Honor." Silence filled the room. The judge nodded once. "Then, the court finds that spoliation has occurred." I didn't react. I didn't smile. I didn't breathe differently. But something inside me settled. The judge continued. "As a result, the court will presume that the destroyed evidence would have been unfavorable to the respondent." Presume. The word carried weight. She went on to order sanctions, financial penalties, an adverse inference, and most importantly, the reinstatement of the amendment's intended distribution pending final resolution. Equal. For the first time, my grandmother's voice had been restored in a room where she could no longer speak. Outside the courthouse, Daniel turned to me. "This changes everything." "Yes," I said. "It does." That evening, my phone rang. Jason. I let it ring. Then again. Then a text. "We need to talk." I didn't reply. An hour later, my father called. "Jason is not doing well," he said. "I know," I replied. "He feels cornered." "So did I said. "For years." "He's your brother," my father said, as if that were a conclusion. "So am I your daughter?" I replied. He had no answer. The next day, Jason showed up at my apartment. I didn't invite him in. We stood in the hallway, like strangers. "You got what you wanted," he said. "No," I replied. "I got what was already mine." He looked at me with something like disbelief. "You always had to complicate things." I studied him. The man who had been protected at every turn. The man who had never been asked to explain himself. "This is what accountability looks like," I said. "It feels complicated when you're not used to it." He scoffed. "You think this makes you better than me?" "No," I said. "It makes me free." He laughed bitterly. "Enjoy your money." "It's not about the money," I replied. "It never was." He leaned closer, his voice low. "You destroyed this family." I met his gaze. "You did that when you decided I didn't deserve a choice." He stood there for a moment, as if waiting for something. An apology, a crack. It didn't come. He left without another word. That night, I sat at my table and opened my grandmother's old recipe box. The one she'd given me years ago because Jason didn't cook. Inside, tucked between cards, was a folded piece of paper I had never noticed before. My handwriting wasn't on it. Hers was. If you're reading this, it means you finally asked questions. I'm proud of you. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I understood now that she had known exactly who I would become. The next phase of the case would determine final distribution, but the outcome was no longer uncertain. Jason's leverage was gone. My parents' silence had turned into avoidance, and I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting to be included. I was standing exactly where I belonged. Once the court imposed sanctions, everything around Jason began to loosen. Not collapse all at once, but slip. Like a knot pulled too tight for too long, finally giving way, thread by thread. The estate was placed under temporary independent administration. A neutral third party took control of the accounts, the house, the investments. For the first time since my grandmother's death, no one in my family had their hands on anything. That alone changed the tone of every conversation. Jason stopped calling. Not because he had found peace, but because he had lost leverage. My parents, on the other hand, started circling again. My mother left a voicemail one morning, her voice careful. The administrator reached out. They need some family history. Would you be willing to help? Willing. The word almost made me laugh. I already have, I said when I called her back. Through the court. She paused. You don't have to be cold. I'm not being cold, I replied. I'm being precise. There was a long silence. Then, your father is having a hard time. I imagine he is, I said. So am I. What I didn't say was that this was the first time I wasn't absorbing their discomfort for them. The administrator, a woman named Helen Brooks, contacted me directly later that week. She was professional, neutral, efficient. I want to understand your grandmother as a person, she said, not just as a set of numbers. So I told her about the recipe box, about the notes she left in books, about the way she insisted on fairness, even when it made things uncomfortable. I gave her copies of letters and cards I had saved, not as evidence this time, but as context. Helen listened. That matters, she said. Intent isn't just legal, it's human. Jason refused to meet with her. That refusal was noted. Meanwhile, something else was happening quietly. Jason's business partners began asking questions, not about the estate, but about his judgment, about his tendency to handle things alone, about what else he might have decided for others without consent. I heard this secondhand, through an old family friend who worked in finance. He called me one evening, his tone cautious. I shouldn't be saying this, he said, but your brother's name is coming up. Not in a good way. I'm not involved in his business, I replied. I know, he said. That's what makes it noticeable. At work, I felt different too. Lighter, more focused. I stopped apologizing for asking questions. I stopped volunteering to cover gaps that weren't mine. When a senior administrator tried to sideline me from a project I had built, I didn't argue. I documented. I followed up in writing. The project stayed with me. Power, I was learning, didn't need volume. In early May, the administrator released a preliminary report. It confirmed what we already knew, but put it in language that couldn't be ignored. The trust amendment had been properly executed. The failure to file it had materially altered the distribution. The recommendation was clear: equal division. Jason's attorney requested one last settlement conference. Daniel asked me what I wanted to do. I'll attend, I said, but I'm not negotiating terms. I'm listening. The meeting was short. Jason looked exhausted, not humbled, exhausted. The kind of tired that comes from realizing the ground you stood on was never solid. His attorney spoke first. Given the administrator's findings, my client is prepared to accept the recommended distribution. Good, Daniel said. So are we. Jason looked at me then. Are you satisfied? The question was loaded, as if satisfaction was the point. I'm finished, I said. There's a difference. He nodded once. No apology, no acknowledgement, just resignation. After the meeting, my father called again. This didn't have to end like this, he said. I leaned against my kitchen counter and closed my eyes. It ended like this because it began with secrecy. You could have let it go, he said. I could have, I replied, but then I would have lost myself. He didn't argue. The final hearing was scheduled for June. In the weeks leading up to it, I packed away things that no longer felt like mine. Old photo albums where I had been cropped out of narratives that centered Jason. Holiday cards signed Love, Mom and Dad, and Jason, as if I were a footnote to my own family. I didn't throw them away. I didn't need to erase the past. I just didn't need to carry it forward. The night before the hearing, I took the folded note from my grandmother out of the recipe box and placed it on my table. If you're reading this, it means you finally asked questions. I understood now that she had seen the pattern long before I did, and she had trusted me to break it. The next day would finalize the estate. But something had already shifted, permanently. I was no longer trying to be seen. I was standing where I could not be ignored. The final hearing was scheduled for June 12th. Early summer, bright morning, the kind of day that usually feels hopeful. I noticed those details because for the first time, the weight in my chest wasn't dread. It was resolve. I arrived early and sat alone in the courtroom, hands folded, posture relaxed. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, nodding once in greeting. No small talk. We were past that stage. Jason arrived last, flanked by his attorney. He looked thinner, not fragile, but stripped of polish. The confidence that once preceded him into every room had dulled into something defensive. My parents followed, sitting together but leaving an empty seat between them and Jason. That distance was new and telling. The judge entered, and the room stood. She reviewed the administrator's final report out loud. Every sentence landed with deliberate weight. The existence of the signed trust amendment, the concealment, the undue influence, the corrective distribution, equal. When she finished, she looked up. Does either party have objections to the administrator's recommendation? Jason's attorney stood. His voice was controlled, resigned. No, Your Honor. Daniel rose next. No objections. The judge nodded once. Then the court adopts the recommendation in full. Just like that, it was done. No gavel slam. No dramatic pause. Just a legal acknowledgement of something that should have never been taken from me in the first place. The estate would be divided evenly. Assets redistributed. Accounts corrected. The house sold and proceeds split. The trust restructured. My grandmother's intent restored. As the judge moved on to procedural details, I noticed my mother staring at her hands. My father kept his eyes on the floor. Jason stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. No one looked at me. I didn't need them to. Outside the courthouse, Daniel shook my hand. You handled this exactly right. Thank you, I said, for not letting me turn this into something it wasn't. He gave a small smile. You never wanted revenge. No, I said. I wanted dignity. Jason walked past us without stopping. For a moment, I thought he might say something. He didn't. Later that afternoon, the administrator transferred the first portion of the assets. The number appeared on my screen without fanfare. Larger than anything I'd ever had at once. Smaller than the cost of what I'd endured to reclaim it. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at it. Then I logged out. Money was a tool, not a finish line. That evening, my mother called. Her voice was quiet, stripped of strategy. I don't recognize us anymore. I leaned back in my chair. Neither do I. Do you hate us? She asked. I considered the question carefully. No, but I don't trust you. The truth landed between us without cruelty. She inhaled sharply. I don't know how to fix that. You don't, I said. You live with it. She didn't argue. A few days later, I ran into an old family friend at the grocery store. She smiled politely, then hesitated. I heard about the court decision, she said. That must have been hard. It was clarifying, I replied. She nodded slowly. Your grandmother would be proud. I believed that. Jason's business troubles became more visible in the weeks that followed. A partnership dissolved. A loan restructured. Quiet consequences for someone who had always assumed outcomes would bend his way. I didn't follow the details closely. I didn't need to. My parents stopped calling entirely. Not out of anger. Out of uncertainty. They no longer knew who I was if I wasn't accommodating, flexible, understanding. I was okay with that. One evening, I opened the recipe box again. This time, I didn't search for notes. I simply chose one at random and cooked dinner the way my grandmother had taught me. Slowly, intentionally, no multitasking. As I ate, I realized something important. This chapter of my life wasn't ending with triumph. It was ending with boundaries. And boundaries, I was learning, were the most honest form of love I could offer myself. The story wasn't over yet, but the control had finally changed hands. The weeks after the ruling were quieter than I expected. No dramatic fallout, no apologies. Just a slow rearranging of reality, like furniture being moved out of a room that had been crowded for too long. The house was the first thing to go. My grandmother's place sat on a tree-lined street in Montclair, the kind of home that looked modest from the outside, but carried decades of memory in its walls. I hadn't been inside since before her funeral. Jason had changed the locks soon after. At the time, my mother told me it was for security. I hadn't questioned it. That was before I learned how often that word was used to justify exclusion. Helen, the administrator, asked if I wanted to walk through the house before it was listed. Yes, I said. I do. Jason declined to come. My parents said they were not ready, so I went alone. The air inside the house smelled like dust and old wood, familiar in a way that tightened my throat. The furniture was still there. The couch where my grandmother used to sit with a blanket folded neatly beside her. The dining table, with one chair slightly looser than the others. The clock in the hallway still ticking, stubborn and steady. Nothing had been staged yet. No one had erased her. I moved through the room slowly. I didn't touch much. I didn't need to. I was there to witness, not to claim. In the bedroom, her dresser drawers were half empty. Jason had already taken some things. Jewelry, probably. Documents. The items that could be converted into value. But on the nightstand, there was a small framed photo I hadn't seen before. It was of the two of us, taken years ago at a farmer's market. I was laughing, head thrown back. She was looking at me, not the camera. I picked it up and felt something settle. This wasn't about what I had lost. It was about what I had almost forgotten. After the house was listed, the offers came quickly. A clean sale, no drama. The proceeds were split as ordered. Jason didn't contest it. He didn't contact me. Instead, my parents did. My father called one afternoon, his voice cautious. "Your mother wants to have dinner. Just the three of us." I paused before answering. "I'm not ready for that. She misses you," he said. "I miss the version of her who didn't ask me to disappear to keep the peace," I replied. Silence followed. "We did what we thought was best," he said finally. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." After I hung up, I felt the familiar urge to soften my words, to call back, to reassure him. I didn't. At work, something unexpected happened. I was offered a promotion. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no grand speech, just a meeting with my director, a closed door, and a sentence that caught me off guard. "You've been carrying more responsibility than your title reflects," she said. "We want to formalize that." I accepted without hesitation. Later that evening, I thought about how often I had been told, at home, that ambition made me difficult, that independence made me less deserving of care. None of that had been true. It had just been inconvenient. Jason's name came up one last time through a mutual acquaintance. He had moved out of my parents' house. His business was downsizing. Nothing catastrophic, just diminished. I felt no satisfaction hearing it, only distance. One night, my mother sent a message, just a sentence. "I wish I had handled things differently." I read it once. Then again, I didn't respond. Regret, I was learning, didn't entitle anyone to access. That weekend, I took the money from the estate and did something practical with it. I paid off my remaining student loans. I set up a long-term investment account. I met with a financial planner and asked questions I'd never been encouraged to ask before. No splurges, no statements, just structure. That night, I slept deeply, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer waiting for permission to move forward. I thought about how often women like me were told to let it go for the sake of harmony. How harmony in my family had always meant silence on my part. I understood now that silence had cost me years. I wasn't angry about that anymore. I was done repeating it. There was one last thing to do before I could fully close this chapter. And it wasn't about my family. It was about me. The last thing I needed to do had nothing to do with courtrooms, documents, or family conversations. It was quieter than all of that. And for that reason, harder. I had to decide who still had access to me. For most of my life, that question had never felt like mine to answer. Access was assumed. Parents, siblings, relatives. You showed up, you explained yourself, you absorbed the tension so no one else had to. That was the role I had been trained for. Now that role was gone. One evening in early July, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote 3 names at the top of the page. My mother, my father, Jason. I didn't write notes beneath them. I didn't need to. The history was already there, etched into my body in ways paper couldn't capture. Instead, I wrote 1 sentence under each name. What does continuing contact cost me? The answer came quickly. With my father, the cost was erosion. He was not cruel, but he was passive in the face of cruelty. He believed that avoiding conflict was the same as keeping peace, even when avoidance required my silence. Every conversation with him carried the unspoken expectation that I would soften my edges so he wouldn't have to choose. With my mother, the cost was distortion. She rewrote reality when it made her uncomfortable. She called control care and favoritism practicality. Being close to her meant constantly questioning my own perception. With Jason, the cost was absolute. He did not see me as a person. He saw me as an obstacle, a variable to be managed. Any contact with him would always be strategic, never honest. I closed the pad. The decision was already made. The next morning, I sent 1 email, addressed to all 3 of them. Short, clear, no accusations. I wrote that I needed space, that I would not be attending family gatherings for the foreseeable future, that I would not be available for discussions about the estate, the past, or moving forward. That if and when I was ready to reconnect, I would initiate it. I read it twice before sending. Then I sent it. The replies came faster than I expected. My father wrote first, a paragraph about misunderstanding, about how families don't give up on each other, about how life is short. My mother followed with something longer, regret mixed with justification, love tangled with guilt, a request to talk just once. Jason didn't reply at all. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I was angry, because I was finished negotiating my worth. In the days that followed, something surprising happened. The noise in my head quieted. No more anticipating reactions. No more rehearsing explanations. No more bracing myself for subtle dismissals disguised as concern. My thoughts felt like my own again. I noticed things I hadn't had space to notice before. How I breathed more deeply when my phone stayed silent. How my shoulders dropped when I realized I didn't owe anyone an update. How restful my evenings became when they weren't filled with emotional cleanup. One Saturday, I drove to the coast alone. I walked along the water, shoes in hand, sand cold beneath my feet. I thought about my grandmother, about the way she had lived in small, deliberate choices. About how she had known, long before I did, that fairness would never be handed to me. I would have to claim it. I understood now why she had trusted me. That night, I framed the photo I had taken from her house and placed it on my bookshelf. Not as a memorial, as a reminder. At work, my promotion settled into place. I was no longer proving myself. I was building something sustainable. I delegated without guilt. I spoke without apology. When someone tried to interrupt me in a meeting, I didn't push back aggressively. I simply continued speaking. People listened. It occurred to me then that power didn't arrive with confrontation. It arrived with certainty. Toward the end of the month, Daniel emailed to confirm that all legal matters related to the estate were officially closed. No pending actions, no loose ends. I thanked him and closed the file on my laptop, literally and figuratively. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window as the sun dipped below the buildings across the street. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt intact. For years, I had been told I was too much and not enough at the same time. Too independent to deserve support, not accommodating enough to deserve fairness. Now, I knew better. I wasn't too much. I had simply been surrounded by people who benefited from me being less. There was only one chapter left to write, and this one would not be about them at all. The morning I realized the story was finally over, nothing dramatic happened. No phone call, no message, no apology wrapped in careful language. I woke up, made coffee, and stood by the window watching the city move the way it always had. Cars, people, life continuing without asking whether I was ready. And for the first time, I was. That was how I knew I was done. Not because everything had been repaired, but because nothing inside me was waiting anymore. I had spent most of my adult life preparing myself to be understood, explaining my choices, justifying my boundaries, softening my voice so others wouldn't feel accused by my clarity. I had believed that if I communicated well enough, eventually someone would meet me where I stood. They never did. What they met instead was my silence, my compliance, my willingness to step back so they could stay comfortable. That was the pattern my grandmother had seen. That was the pattern Jason exploited. That was the pattern my parents protected. And breaking it had cost me a family. But it had given me myself. I took a day off work and walked through the city without an agenda. No errands, no obligations. I stopped at a bookstore I hadn't visited in years and bought a novel purely because I liked the first sentence. I sat in a cafe and watched people come and go without wondering whether I should be somewhere else. Freedom, I realized, didn't feel loud. It felt quiet. In the afternoon, I went through my apartment and made small changes. I moved furniture. I donated clothes I had kept out of habit rather than love. I cleared a drawer that had been full of old documents and found nothing in it that tied me to the past anymore. When I finished, the space felt lighter. Not empty. Intentional. That evening, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. "I think about you every day." I read it once. Then I placed the phone face down on the table and let it sit there. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing her, but because I finally understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Missing me did not entitle her to me. Love, without accountability, was just another form of control. Later that night, I opened my laptop and wrote a single paragraph. Not for anyone else, just for me. I wrote that I had survived being minimized by the people who should have protected me, that I had chosen truth over harmony, even when it cost me comfort, that I had learned the difference between being included and being respected. I saved the file and closed the laptop. The next chapter of my life didn't need documentation. It needed direction. A few weeks later, I received a forwarded message from a distant cousin. It was part of a family email chain I was no longer included in. Someone had asked whether I would be coming to Thanksgiving. My mother had replied before anyone else could. "She needs space. Please respect that." I stared at the screen for a long moment. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. But it was something new. And for the first time, I didn't feel tempted to step back in. I understood now that boundaries weren't walls meant to punish others. They were doors I controlled. I closed the message and went for a walk. As the months passed, my life continued to expand in small, steady ways. I took on a new project at work that excited me. I made friends who didn't know my family history and didn't need to. I traveled alone for the first time and learned that solitude didn't mean loneliness. It meant presence. Sometimes I thought about Jason, about how easily he had assumed the world would bend to him, about how shocked he'd been when it didn't. I didn't wish him harm. I simply wished him accountability. And I let karma handle the rest. On the anniversary of my grandmother's birthday, I made one of her recipes and ate dinner alone at my table. I raised my glass, not in mourning, but in gratitude. She had given me more than an inheritance. She had given me permission. Permission to ask questions. Permission to take up space. Permission to walk away from people who only loved me when I was manageable. If there is one thing I know now, it's this. Being excluded hurts. Being controlled hurts longer. And choosing yourself will cost you relationships that were never built to hold your truth. But it will give you something far more valuable. Your voice, your dignity, your life. If you've ever been pushed aside by family, if you've ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of peace, if you've ever felt erased by people who benefited from your silence, know this: you are not selfish for choosing yourself. You are not dramatic for setting boundaries, and you are not wrong for walking away from what keeps you small. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not destruction, it's refusal. Refusal to be controlled, refusal to be erased, refusal to disappear so others can stay comfortable. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts. Tell me where you drew your line, or where you're still learning how to. And if you want to hear more stories about reclaiming power, setting boundaries, and watching the tables turn, stay connected. Some stories aren't meant to be forgiven. They're meant to be survived.